Hi everyone. This is my first answer in my questions and answers from the Bible. Let's call it series or playlist or whatever. The idea is that people ask me questions from the Bible and I try to give them good biblical answers. So, the first question is from Judges 9, verse 45. We read there that after Abimelech kills all of the inhabitants of the city, he strews salt all over the city. So the question is, why is the city strewn with salt? What does that mean? And where did he get all of the salt? Right, so before we begin with the answer, I just want to give a brief overview of what happens in Judges 9. So Judges 9 start with Abimelech that whips up the inhabitants of Shechem against Gideon's sons. He is also one of Gideon's sons. And these inhabitants of Shechem give Abimelech money to hire men to help him kill his half brothers. Jotham, the youngest brother, hides like his father Gideon did before in a wine press. Jotham doesn't hide in a wine press, but he only hides. And consequently, like Gideon, he also survives. Then the citizens of Shechem make Abimelech king. Then the brother who survived, Jotham, climbs to the top of Mount Gerizim and shouts out his parable or his curse to the citizens of Shechem, in which he presents his brothers as trees, and in the parable he makes it clear that the inhabitants of Shechem chose the most incompetent tree of all of them, namely Abimelech, to be their king. Abimelech then reigns for 3 years, but 3 years later, God turns the tables and the inhabitants of Shechem turn against Abimelech and set up ambushes against him when Gaal, a new character on the scene, and his brothers move to Shechem, and the Shechemites turn their back on Abimelech and listens to Gaal. After that, Abimelech retaliates and sets up ambushes against Gaal. He defeats Gaal and then he fights against the city. And the verse in question, Judges 9, verse 45, says, all day Abimelech pressed his attack against the city until he had captured it and killed its people. Then he destroyed the city and scattered salt over it. Then Abimelech burns the people of the Shechem tower in the cellar where they fled to, about 1,000 men and women. After that, Abimelech moves to the place called Thebes and also conquers Thebes. But in the middle of the battle at Thebes, the people flee to the strong tower and they climb on the roof of the tower. And when Abimelech has the same plan to burn down the tower, when he comes close to the tower, a woman throws a millstone on his head from above. The Bible says that his head was crushed. He, of course, knew that he was going to die, and then he called his armor bearer and told him to kill him so that no one could say that he was killed by a woman. Right, so what is important about this story for us to know? So, firstly, I've been talking about Gideon, but in this passage, Gideon is called Jerubbaal. And this name was given to Gideon after he destroyed his family's altar to the false god Baal. And Jerubbaal means let Baal fight against him. Abimelech's history already begins in Judges 9. It is said that Gideon lived in Ophrah and also had a concubine in Shechem. With this slave girl, Gideon had a son, and that is, of course, Abimelech. And chapter 9 is all about this son, Abimelech. So The old proverb says, "What you sow, you will reap." The story of Abimelech is a striking illustration of this proverb. God made the injustice that Abimelech did to his father and his brothers rightfully return on his own head. And God made the evil that the inhabitants of Shechem did by helping Abimelech become king boomerang on themselves. Abimelech, of course, whipped up the inhabitants of Shechem against his brothers, and later Gaal, the new character, whipped up the inhabitants of Shechem against Abimelech. The inhabitants of Shechem set up ambushes against Abimelech, and later ambushes were set up against them by Abimelech. The most important boomerang effect, of course, was Abimelech, who kills 69 of his brothers with one stone, but later this stone crushes his head and leads to his death. This story beautifully illustrates to us the consequences for people who listen to the wrong people, follow the wrong advice, and also for people who follow the wrong leaders. And the point is that there is always consequences because sin has consequences. So, the lesson we can learn or the takeaway for us is make sure that the people that you follow are followers of Jesus Christ. The chapter closes with these two verses that illustrate it beautifully. So then God repaid the evil of Abimelech that he did to his father by killing his brothers, and all the evil of the men of Shechem God brought down upon their own heads, and the curse of Jotam the son of Jerubbaal came upon them. Okay, but the question that is being asked is, why is the city strewn with salt, and what does that mean, and where did they get all of the salt? So firstly, let me begin by saying salt can have a positive or negative character in the Bible. In this case, it's used negatively. By sprinkling the city with salt, the city is, in abbreviations, contaminated with permanent barrenness or barrenness. For example, in our own worlds today, we cannot drink water that has salt in it, and we usually throw some salt on the weeds that grow in our driveways to kill the weeds. Just like in these two cases, by sprinkling the city with salt, Abimelech, makes sure that nothing will grow back in the soil of that city. And so he makes the whole city barren and he kills it, he makes it dead. And the following two Bible passages illustrate something of that to us. In Deuteronomy 29, verses 22 to 24, we read, "And the next generation, your children who rise up after you, and the foreigners who come from a far country will say, when they see the plagues of the land and its diseases that the Lord has caused to break out in it, also brimstone and salt, because its entire surface is burned up, which is not sown and does not cause anything to sprout, in which no plant grow at all, like the reversal of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord has turned in his anger and in his fury. And all the nations will say, what has the Lord done to this land? What does this great wrath mean? Or wrath mean? And the next illustration is in Jeremiah 17, verse 6, where we read, "And he will be like a bare bush in the wilderness, and he will not see when the good comes, but inhabit dry places in the desert, a barren and uninhabited land." All right, so let's start by answering the question, by answering where did they get all of the salt. So in the time of the Bible, especially in the Middle East, salt was not necessarily scarce but difficult to obtain, or in other words, the process of getting salt was difficult in most cases, and therefore salt was expensive. The Dead Sea, of course, was one of the great sources of salt, and then there were also other ways to get salt, such as pouring seawater into wells and then letting the water dry up so that only the salt remained, and then the salt had to be harvested. In this case, we can assume that because Abimelech was king, he would have had enough money and resources to obtain a lot of salt. And although we don't know exactly how the whole city was sprinkled, we can assume that the salt was brought from wherever they got it, or from wherever they bought it, from the Dead Sea or from elsewhere. And then it was scattered all over the city to make it barren, literally, but also symbolically for all to see. This act therefore showed how much effort Abimelech was willing to go through in order to destroy the city completely and forever. And it shows, in a sense, how deep his hatred went. So, to sprinkle the city with salt is to kill the city permanently. It was therefore a literal action, but also a symbolic action to show that the city is destroyed completely and that there will be no chance of life in the future for the city. But we can end off by saying, but still, God did not let Abimelech's attempt succeed, because later in history, King Jeroboam does rebuild Sichem as a fruitful city. In 1 Kings 12, verse 25, we can read about that, and that's all because God is powerful and almighty, and to God all things are possible. Right, so hopefully that answers the question. Thank you very much.